session is about Node Project Configuration Management at Scale, which is quite a mouthful. I could probably make that title a little bit shorter. Just a little bit about me quickly. I have been writing code for 29 years, have gone through many careers of different languages over the years, but what I am mainly focused on most recently is AWS. Think everything around AWS, architecture and using their services, a lot of serverless. And I find myself writing TypeScript more often than any other language lately. And the tool that I'm talking about today is also built by AWS, and its primary home language is TypeScript as well. I've had my own consulting agency for a number of years called Sumo Consulting. I've recently joined a company called Codrifters. They're here in Atlanta as well. I'm also based in Atlanta. And they were here last year with the Tech Stack Brewing. If anybody was here last year and saw the Tech Stack Brewing, that's those guys. I'm a Cub Scout dad. That's my son, Adrian. And I really like to play foosball. So if we end up tonight or tomorrow night at a place that has foosball and anybody likes to play that, please come and find me and talk to me about it. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about kind of the scope of the problem, the surface area of trying to configure Node projects and what all of the problems that you face, which a lot of people are probably familiar with, but if you really think about it, it's quite a lot of things when you configure a Node project today with all the packages that are required. We'll go into a quick diversion into some related packages and tools that you might find interesting that we will not deep dive into. And then we'll start talking about the tool, which is called Progen. It's an AWS library. And then we'll look at some code and do Q&A. Those last two things are kind of squishy time fillers. I'm not exactly sure what pace I'll go at here, so hopefully we'll have a little bit of time left at the end. So to begin with, I started thinking, how did we get here? Why is it so complicated? If you go back to the beginning and you look at what it took to create a Node project in the beginning, you just did npm init-y. It would create something about like this, which seems very simple, but of course, it's not that simple. That's a lie. It's much more complicated than that. I asked ChatGPT to tell me, to give me an image that represents a typical Node project, and it spit this out, which is kind of its typical bubbly, icon-y sort of imagery. But I do think it captures a little bit of the complexity and all the moving pieces that you typically end up with in a Node project, even if you didn't start out wanting it to be that way. So, how do you, if you're not going to use your init script like that anymore, how are you going to create a Node project? And there's three ways that I see people, everybody in this room has probably created a project in one of these three ways in the past. One is to use a create script. This is probably the most popular one. Create React app. Vue has a create script. Astro, any tool that you see now in the Node ecosystem is going to have some kind of a create script. The problem is that just is out of date almost immediately because that's maintained somewhere else. But once you create your Node project, the files that you have created are kind of frozen in time, and if you want to update them, you have to keep up with that yourself. The second strategy that I see is taking an existing project that is configured kind of the way you want your new project to be configured and use that as a starting point. Copy it, and then just start making changes from there. Same problem. It's not going to stay in sync with whatever you copied it from. It's going to become out of date pretty quickly. And the last strategy is just starting from zero and building it up from scratch as a artisanal, custom-built Node project, which is a little insane, but probably everyone's tried that at least once in their life as well. But no matter which of these three strategies you decide to use, kind of like a new car driving off the lot of a car dealer, it starts becoming obsolete almost immediately. It starts accumulating debt, and your project starts to see age almost immediately. So I'm going to dig into these. There's a lot of these slides. Last time I gave this, I spent too long on these, but just to go over what some of the complexities are, you're going to have package config, which is package.json. If you're distributing your code to NPM, you're going to have some files. If you're using workspaces, you're going to have some kind of workspace configuration, either in package.json or in a separate file, like the pnpm workspace file. You've got dependencies that you have to maintain, and these aren't just regular dependencies. You may have dev dependencies, peer dependencies, bundled dependencies, particularly if you're working on a project that's going to be redistributed and packaged in the more complex packages will end up having a lot of these different types of dependencies. And beyond just what the dependencies are, keeping up with version bumps and making sure that they're compatible with each other, security patching. There are some tools out there like Dependabot that is a GitHub thing, or Renovate, and there's some others that will attempt to keep your packages up to date, but none of these are perfect, and each one of these also requires some sort of JSON, YAML, some kind of configuration file somewhere that even if it's doing its job, you have to maintain the config for it, so it's still giving you even one more thing to maintain. Beyond those things, you're probably gonna end up with some coverage tools. Your security team is gonna have some security tools that you need to put in there, and all of these things also have configuration files. Even the license that you put in here, the Apache license is what Progen uses by default. Having to cut and paste that into your project every time is also kind of a pain, and especially in a regulatory environment where you wanna have everything have exactly the right license, and you've got many, many repos inside of your enterprise, you're gonna wanna enforce even something as basic as licensing is a piece of configuration as well. You've got scripts that live in your package.json file. For a lot of the front-end people, this conference has a lot more front-end people, I think, which is usually you're gonna have a dev build preview, but a lot of projects will also have a test. If you're distributing a package, you're gonna have some kind of compile process, you're gonna have packaging, you're gonna have a release process, you may need to have some custom script just for watching. And these scripts often call each other. They become very long, complicated statements, so managing these scripts become a problem. That's also something that Progen handles pretty well. You've got different package managers. You may be trying to switch from Yarn to NPM or PNPM. You may mix them up in a mono repo, or you may have separate repos. And PNPM, for example, has this little thing that it wants to have inside the package.json that doesn't really have anything to do with workspaces or any other kind of PNPM stuff. It's just something that it wants to find in your package.json file. And knowing that it needs to be there and putting it there automatically is nice to have. Git configuration to ignore files. I'm skip through some of those kind of quickly. TypeScript config, you may have many different types of TypeScript config, depending on whether you're targeting production or development or other environments that you may have. You're gonna have multiple ones of those potentially. Linting, and this is where you start seeing configurations start to interact with each other a little bit more, because Prettier and ESLint normally have to be configured properly to work together. And you may also have TypeScript configuration here on line 16 inside of your ESLint to say, we're going to use ESLint, but follow the tsconfig file over here. So you've got 3 different libraries trying to interact here simultaneously. So Progen will abstract a lot of that away and understand all these interdependencies and write or not the configuration that's needed based on the tools that you're using. You've got testing frameworks, which are unit tests, but also end-to-end tests, Lighthouse tests if you want to run that after the end of a run. Those are all things that are configurations that need to be maintained. You may have VS Code configs that you want to maintain for your team to make sure everyone's IDE is configured the same. You're going to have specific configurations for your frameworks. React, Tailwind, Next, Nux. Not all of these are supported by Progen currently. Next and Nux are, React is. Some of the others, there is some work in progress, or you could build your own as well. You're going to have some sort of automation. You're going to have GitHub Actions, or GitLab, Circle CI, whoever you're using as your vendor. Each one of those has a slightly different configuration file. Again, we're still just talking about like YAML and JSON config files here. But beyond just Node, you're going to need to have these things configured as well to make your project work well. And these are managed by Progen as well. And it's not just one. You will probably have a build process, a build pipeline. You might have a release pipeline. You might have a pipeline. One of the ones that Progen supplies you out of the box is one to do updates for version bumps. And that's a nice one to have as well. And then beyond all of those files that need to be configured, if you are a larger organization or even a small organization with a lot of code, you may end up with mono repos of many projects within one repository that are configured mostly the same, but slightly differently. Some of them may be on different versions of Node. Some of them may be Java projects next to Python projects. So this does go a little bit beyond just Node configuration, even though that's the title of the talk. Or you may have multiple repos, and you say you have 100 repositories. You've acquired a lot of different companies, over the time that your company has existed. And as you've acquired them, you've accumulated all of these slightly different node project configurations and tooling, and you would like to start to consolidate all those into one common sort of configuration, this is a tool that can help you with that as well. But these are things that make it even more complicated beyond one repository alone. So how to manage this? Of course, what I'm talking about today is this tool called Progen. And I've got some QR codes for some of these. I'll have the slides at the end available as well. So this site, Progen.io, that this links to is a documentation site. It's fairly new and it's pretty good. And what Progen is a library that some of the AWS employees came up with in order to make their lives easier to generate node configs. And over time, it's continued to grow. It's open source, and there's a pretty healthy set of contributors. They have one, Mr. Grain is his username. I can't remember what his actual name is. He lives in Europe. That's kind of the overlord of the repo to make sure that it's moving forward in a healthy way. It's been around about 3 years now, I think. And the way that they describe it is that Progen is a tool that synthesizes project configuration files, which is everything that we just talked about, from well-defined, well-typed definitions, which is the TypeScript piece of it. It is written in JSII compatible languages. I'm going to come back to that because that may be a new term to a lot of people. And that it reduces project configuration management fatigue. So the cognitive load, you having to worry about your project configuration all the time instead of writing actual code, it reduces that cognitive load for you. It increases productivity. So that's kind of from their website, their statement. And that's how I see it breaking down. I'll get back to the JSII piece in a minute, but JSII is actually what enables Progen to operate in all of these languages. It's written in TypeScript, but JSII exports it so that if your native language that you're most comfortable with is Go, then you can actually write your project config in Go instead of TypeScript. You can write it in Java if you prefer Java, and you can write it in Python. These are the ones they officially support right now in Progen, but JSII as a language supports more than these. They just haven't implemented any more of them than this. So you may wonder, what is JSII? This is a quick diversion. I'm just going to have a slide here about it, and if you want to learn more, you can look it up. This is something that is in the same kind of family of tooling that Progen is, in my mind, from AWS, and it is what they use to produce their SDKs. So if you look at this and one other tool they use to produce their SDKs. So if you look at the JavaScript SDK version 3 of AWS SDK and the Python one and the Go SDK, they're all generated out of one common system, and JSII is what exports it to all these different languages so that the interface is identical to all of them. So JSII is basically a wrapper around the TypeScript code to convert those language calls. If you're instantiating a class in one language, the syntax is slightly different. So it converts it so that you can use that slightly different syntax, Python syntax, Go syntax, whatever you want to use, and it's going to end up calling the same root TypeScript code under the covers. Now that's not very efficient if you're running an Express or a Lambda or some kind of real-time application, but that's not what this tool is for. This tool is to Progen is to generate your project configuration, and you're doing that every now and then. You're not doing it continuously, and it doesn't have to run real time for your customers. So the fact that there's an abstraction layer on top of it, the JSII for Go and these other languages, is not really a penalty at all. Oh, I do have more than one slide on JSI. So I've got a quick example here. If you've got a class that is this little greeter class, and you've written some TypeScript, it boils down to this sort of JavaScript call where you're doing a const and you're instantiating the class by saying new greeter. If you have Java, it's going to look slightly different. Your syntax is a little bit different. You're going to use final instead of const. And if you're in Python, you're not going to need the const at all. And then if you're in Go, it's a little different still. And also you'll notice when you call the greet function, it's capitalized. The syntax standard for Go is to have capitalized function names or method names. And in these other languages is lowercase. So what JSII is doing is just rewiring it to work with all these different types of syntax. Two more tools I'll talk about, and then we're done with the diversions. Along with JSII and Progen. Two other tools that you may be interested in learning more about that I think of in the same family as the others are the CDK, which is the Cloud Development Kit. All of these tools synthesize code. So CDK is going to synthesize CloudFormation code, which is what you use with AWS, kind of like Terraform. It does very similar things to Terraform to deploy code. So it's a code generator, just like the others. And then Smithy is a project that AWS uses along with JSII to generate all those SDKs. So Smithy is something that takes a very basic definition of what you want your interface to look like, and it uses JSII to spit out all those SDKs. Just a little side, I just think these are all very cool projects to kind of learn a little bit about and explore. So I wanted to mention them because I think they all kind of go together. Back to Progen. The Progen roadmap right now, it's been at version 0 for, I think, about 3 years. They're trying to get it to a 1.0 release. They've got a ticket. The QR code here goes to the ticket, or an issue, open at GitHub, defining all of the things that they think that they need to do in order to call this a 1.0 release. And there are a bunch of things in the list, but really they boil down to these 3 primary things. Refactoring, there are some places, for example, the root of the project, it assumes that all projects are hosted at GitHub. So if you're hosted at GitLab or some other place, you can still make GitLab work, but there are just some assumptions under the covers the original author made that they'd like to refactor. Documentation was a little weak. It's much better now. The Progen.io website has some great examples. It's still not going to be quite as nice as, especially front-end devs who've seen, Astro, some of these other sites that just have fantastic, very complete documentation. It is really good, but it may not be quite as good as some of those yet. They're working on it. And then Windows support, which I've actually used Progen on Windows. It works. I've had it work. I don't know what part of it doesn't work on Windows, but it's part of their ticket. Something doesn't work on Windows. I don't know what it is. So that's the last thing they want to clean up before they call it 1.0. So let's talk a little about if you want to use Progen. I keep talking about Progen in this abstract way. How do you actually begin using it? So if you want to build a brand new TypeScript project, blank slate, this is similar to the first method of creating projects that I talked about earlier. You do npx progen new TypeScript, and TypeScript is one of the categories of projects you can create. And this is all that you need in order to build that initial project out. Now, the biggest difference between the Create React app or some of the other creation scripts is that this will also build out some scripts that will continually update Progen as well. So your project doesn't get old. It will self-mutate, and it will continue to update the Progen library itself. And if there's a template change, for example, GitHub Actions recently required something about saving artifacts. There was some permission that needed to be set or not set when you save an artifact and forward it to the next step. And they were able to change that centrally in Progen, and just everybody that had that just got that automatically, so you didn't have to worry about going to change that in your repo. Here's some other, if you do the help command, it's going to tell you the other kinds of apps. You can see Java. Java projects are supported. Next.js with or without TypeScript. Plain Node without any kind of TypeScript is also supported. Python, React with and without TypeScript. TypeScript apps, and then the plain TypeScript one is actually very similar, but it is considered a package. So it will also, if you do just the plain TypeScript without the app, it will also package it and prepare it to go to NPM. And if you fill in the right details in the configuration, it's going to go ahead and handle shipping it off to NPM and version bumping and all of those things that you would typically want in a JavaScript package as well. And then the top area is a lot of other AWS-specific things that if you're kind of a back-end person or a cloud person may be familiar to you, but these are really just other AWS-specific sorts of projects. Questions? I've talked a lot before I go to the next thing. Is that making sense? I'm going fast. All right. So once you create your project, in the root folder, you're going to have this file that is .progenrc.ts. It's a TypeScript file, and this is where the rubber meets the road. This is basically where you define that you want a TypeScript project that might say Node project instead if you chose that option, or React project if you chose that option. And there's only 2 really required arguments. They're on line 5 and 6 here. It's the name, which becomes the name in your package JSON, and it goes on a few other places in your project as well. And then the default release branch, because initially when they built it, it was master, and main is more common now. And so anyway, you have to put main in there. It won't let you just leave no default. There's no default anymore. You have to put it in there. By default, Progen is going to use Yarn as a package manager. So if you like that, you can leave this line out. If you prefer NPM or PNPM, you can add that in there. So that's an optional one. And then 8 and 9 are just showing where the source directory would be src, put all the tests in a test folder. And I think in front-end dev, I more commonly see them kind of combined into one folder, and it would support that as well. You can just change the configuration option there. And then the last line here, so this defines the things that you want in your project. And inside of this class, it's also composing stuff from all kinds of other configurations that you might need. And it has some very sane defaults. So it's like batteries included, lots of defaults. It's going to configure Jest. It's going to configure lots of things for you automatically. And then this last line here, this synth command is a nomenclature that they use in CDK, and they also use it here in Progen. And this represents synthesizing all the files. So all of this is constructing, I guess, something similar to the virtual DOM in front end. So this is saying, build what the configuration should be, but it's still just like classes and objects and configurations that are virtual. This is saying, now write them all to file. So you can do, between your definition and the synth, you can do lots of other things to say, and also Jest should be configured this way, and also I'd like another workflow for GitHub that does this, and you can configure all of those things before you do the synth. Since it's TypeScript, you get this real nice introspection in any IDE that supports it, so that if you need to know, for example, you would like to make some change when you're starting your TypeScript project to the tsconfig file, what are the compiler options that it supports? It's going to tell you what all those are so that you can start putting in values and know whether it's a Boolean or what kind of value can go there, which is very helpful. And I've given these examples as a TypeScript project, and I'll show you kind of how the original author set this up, was that all projects inherit from this root project, which has some very basic things. No Jest, no nothing really. It's just some very basic configurations. From that, node project inherits project, so this will configure some node-specific things, some package JSON, things like that node expects to have. And then so you can just instantiate this if you want. If you want to create a TypeScript project, it's going to have everything node project did, plus layer on some other things. So the node project might configure Jest. TypeScript project is like, all right, where to get Jest? Let's put TS_Jest in there and configure that properly, and some other things that have to do with TypeScript beyond just the TypeScript definition or the TypeScript configuration. It's going to also know that you're using Jest, and there's some TypeScript things that need to go there as well. So it's going to do all those things. And then the CDK, which I won't go into a lot of detail, but just to show that you can get into more and more kind of advanced sorts of project configurations just by inheriting here. One of the flaws early on from the author is they favored inheritance over composition a little bit too much, like the GitHub, the assumption everybody's on GitHub is just baked into like this guy. And they have to extract that out and put it back in as an individual component. But they're working on that. But one of the nice things that you can do here, these are all out of the box that you get from Progen. If you are in a company and you say, well, I don't really use these, this TypeScript project uses tsnode by default, for example, and tsc to do compilations. You may not want that. So you may want to say, I want to use Vite instead. So you can create your own project type and extend node and configure it however you want using all of the little components that come with Progen. So you can add back in every configuration file individually and configure them the way you want in your own custom Vite project. You may say, I use Astro, and Astro uses Vite. Then you can stack these on top of each other and add additional configurations for Astro on top of that. You may have a compliance. You may work in a regulatory environment that requires certain security features be lit up or configured inside of your app. So you may have a compliance group that wants to have a specific project type that has testing and static code analysis and all the other things, all the tools that they're going to want you to have in there. So these come with Progen, but the other three over here are things that you could build if you want to and distribute within your company. And this is where it really starts to shine, because if you're a large enterprise and you have 100 different node repos and they're not a mono repo, they're just separate, you can take this standard compliance project, any of these, you can publish them as packages, consume them in those other projects, and when you run the synthesize, then it will do whatever you told it to do inside of these. So it's a way to distribute project configurations across your enterprise in a common way. And you can also leave things out. If you've got 100 repos and you're going to try to implement this, you're probably not going to get everything right. That's a lot of config to rewrite. So you probably want to start with something simple, like we're just going to do uniform jest configs. And next, we're just going to do uniform, whatever the next thing is, just to try to get things in line. So you can incrementally adopt it if you want to. When it generates files, when you do that synth, it's going to generate files. It's going to add this little comment in all of them. Generated by Progen. If you want to modify it, rerun the Progen command. Same thing for like a YAML file. This is a GitHub action. This is just packaged JSON. It makes all these read-only. It really doesn't want you to edit them. If you adopt this tool, you can edit them. You can mark them, readable again. But every time you run Progen, it's going to overwrite it. So it makes them read-only, and it puts this comment in here so that humans know that you're not supposed to edit this file. Really, there's a reason that it's read-only. As far as testing goes, there are some test utilities that Progen comes with. This synth snapshot is really, really useful. This is an example of a quick test where I start a TypeScript project with just a couple of values here, and then I'm going to say I want to synthesize this project and look at what the VS Code settings JSON file is and take a snapshot test of it so that I can look and make sure the content of this JSON hasn't changed as I'm adapting my custom solution. Yep.
Another question: if you can't edit any of the config files, is that all done through the command from the project command line?
Yeah, and I'll show the command to actually gen everything in just a second. But yeah, you would just generate it, and that is also part of some of the GitHub action workflows as well, to regenerate it and self-mutate and then actually check things back in for you. So that's next, actually. So in order to run that synthesizing, you just run Progen, npx Progen, and it will basically look at there's a script called default, and that's the one that it will run, and that's the one that synthesizes everything. Under the covers, what it's running is TS node. It's going to get your TS config, dev config, and then it's going to run that progenrc.ts. That's the TypeScript file I was showing you earlier where you can configure everything. So it's really just saying use TS node to run this file with this configuration, and then everything gets built out. One of the conventions that you'll see if you read through the docs that pretty much everybody I know has adopted is you put in your bash or your ZSHRC file an alias just for PJ, and that way if you want to rebuild everything, you just say PJ instead of having to remember npx Progen, especially if you're developing custom project types. You're going to be running this just like constantly trying to see what is happening, so that's just a shortcut that people tend to use. So you just say PJ. You can also put it into watch mode with --watch, and that's just going to look for changes, just like regular watching, which is really useful. You're generating several files when you do that, so you kind of should look out for exactly what your surface area is that you're changing. And I'll say also, there are some changes you can make in Progen that are a little bit of foot guns. For example, if you decide that you want to switch from Yarn to NPM as your package manager, it's going to really nuke a lot of stuff in your code base, and you're going to have to reinstall some of your node modules. That's uncommon that you're going to do that a lot, so it's not really a problem, but there are some of those really high level when you're first experimenting. You're like, oh, what happens if I switch it from Yarn to something else? It's going to maybe mess you up a little bit. Just think about what it did. You may have to run pmpmi or npmi or whatever in order to make sure your node modules folder is clean again. And that's it for the slides. I have some code I can show. This QR code goes to a repo that has the code I'm about to show you in it, and the slide decks, I gave this 2 months ago. That slide deck's in there. I'll put this slide deck in after I'm done because I have made changes to it up until 5 minutes ago, or 20 minutes ago, or 40 minutes ago. So I'll show code now. I always forget to come back to this last slide, so I'm going to go ahead and put it here in case anybody wants to take a quick shot of it. This is my LinkedIn, my personal website, my sumo consulting company that I've had around a long time, Codrifters, company I just joined, Twitter, who I probably post once a year there. If you want to follow me, you can read that one message per year. Before I go to code, any questions? Yep.
Does Project at all allow like configuration with existing projects, or is it you just got to start with a project from scratch and then copy it?
You can do it in an existing project, but it really wants to take over. So, like I said, if you've got 100 projects and you're trying to incrementally adopt it, that's possible. But you do have to plan ahead a little bit about that and turn off a lot of the things that it wants to create, tell it not to create them, so that it really limits the scope. And especially when you're first experimenting with it, I would just start a new project. With the snapshot testing that I showed, where you can synthesize the file without writing it to disk and then do a snapshot test against it, you can take the files in your existing project and use that as your snapshot comparison. So you can even copy that whole project as a subfolder inside of test and say, this is my eventual state that I desire. Write a bunch of tests that will generate your synthesized code, compare it to what the actual file in the project looked like until you get it right. So that's one way to iterate. Let me turn on mirroring so I can actually see the same thing. Where's that button? Here it is. There we go, mirroring. Everybody read that? Is it big enough? If you can't, speak up. I assume you can't otherwise. So this is a Project RC file that I just have turned on some random things. I can turn them on and off, and you can kind of see what it does as I do. I've got a terminal window here. I'm going to type pj-watch. So as we make changes, hopefully this will run successfully. Watching. So it's watching for changes, and we'll see what changes as I edit some of the values in here. So this is a TypeScript project. I just call it Project Examples. It will configure Mergify by default. Let me go to the Git changes here. So if I decide that I did want to use Mergify after all, wait for it to update, and you'll see it's made some changes. It created a Mergify config for me. Come on. Didn't mean to do that. Mergify config for me here. How do I remove this? I don't ever use the integrated. There we go. So it created a Mergify config for me. So it knows about a lot of tools, like I said. That's a YAML file. It also made some other changes. In my Git attributes, this is how, one of the ways that Project tracks the files that it generated is it saves this file, the Git attributes file, and it lists all these linguist generated as some kind of special thing that I don't know enough about Git to understand, but it basically flags them all and says, these are generated by code, don't edit them, and Git understands that way too. Git ignore, it's adding it to Git ignore. It's saying don't ignore this. So it's making sure that this gets checked in. So it's saying don't ignore Mergify, check that in. And then it's also, in the npm ignore, it is saying, if you release this to npm ever, don't include the Mergify configuration, right? Which is, these are all changes you'd have to think of, particularly excluding it from packaging, that you might not figure out until you've already accidentally packaged up your Mergify and stuck it out there into a package in the public space. So those are all really nice to have things. I'm going to switch this back so we get back to the default state. For node packaging, it does have, by default, Apache 2 license. So I'm gonna just say, instead, now I've decided I don't want to license my package. It's going to make some changes for me. It's removed the license file. It's also removed that from the git ignore and from the git attributes. And it's also changed my license from Apache 2 and my package.json from Apache 2 to unlicensed. So again, this is like reaching its tendrils into all these little files that you might have to update with just that one line of code change. And if you imagine taking this sort of a rule and saying we want all our software to be under a certain license and distributing that out, or any of these values out to all the packages or all the repos that are inside of your enterprise, it starts to really accelerate a lot of these common configuration things and making sure that they're the same, the way that you want them to be. Not going to change this value because it will really break everything. The version of Node that you want to be on, there is a default. I've just changed it from the default to say, I specifically want to run on Node 20.15.0. It's going to make changes to package.json to make sure that I've got the right types. So this is another nice to have. I've just changed the version that I want to run on, and maybe you forget to update what types you have imported. This is in the PNPM lock file, so this is showing me that this is the version that I'm supposed. Oh, this is actually just the type, so this is fine. And then this is the build script for GitHub. So this is our pipeline to do a build, and it's saying when you set up Node, make sure that we have this specific version when we do our builds. Again, these are all like little things, details that you have to think about, all this extra cognitive load. If you're making this sort of a change, and you need to go hunt down every place in your project that needs to understand this change. Prettier is not on by default, but I turn it on usually. Packaging, if you turn this to true, it's going to create a package script for GitHub Actions for you, and you can feed in some values here where it says release to NPM. I'm saying no. If you turn on package, it builds the package like a zip file. If you say release to NPM, then you can also put in details about NPM, and it's going to go ahead and put a publish script in GitHub Actions as well for you, so that you can do the whole thing all the way through. I'm just going to kind of, unless somebody has something in particular they're interested in seeing, it will by default put the configuration for Jest in the project. So I had said I would like the Jest config to be in this separate JSON file. That's how I like to do it. By default, Progen is going to stick it inside this package.json file, which I don't like. It kind of pollutes it a little bit, I think. So all of these things, I'm just changing one line of code here and there, and it's making quite a lot of changes in my project. There's one other thing I was going to show, but I'm going to stop in case there's more questions on some of the things or something somebody wants to see.
So you were saying it seems like it only will overwrite the entire files. It won't make like small changes to the file.
Right. Okay. It's not going to change a single file. It will definitely overwrite the whole thing. Yeah.
And as far as you were talking about the GitHub assumption, does it have some mechanism where it can actually write to all your repositories?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the I'll get back to you in a second. The workflow that it's going to build here. Pull request. I'm not sure I'm building one actually that requires that. Let me turn on packaging and see. It'll build one. Package true. Release true. Let's see what this does. So this is going to create. Oh, I get an error. This is what happens live coding. Let's turn on release. Okay, all done. So now I've got a release pipeline, and this is for my package in case I was packaging something up. So you can see there's a release job here. Once build happens, the release is going to check out the code, sets up npm, installs dependencies, It will back up permissions on all the files that you're going to be putting on npm. It's going to upload the artifact, which is in GitHub Actions, just like save these files. We're going to need them in the next step. And then there's a next step here, which is published to GitHub releases. So it does understand all the, I think I'm answering your question. It understands all the files that you're going to need in your next workflow step, saves them correctly into a place, even saves all the file permissions so that they get restored when you do the next step. Does that answer your question?
So I'm thinking I've got like hundreds of repositories.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to push out, say, a GitHub action to all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I make a change. Does it actually write those files?
you would need to put Progen in every project in order for that to happen. And you can think about consolidating those into a monorepo while you're at it and use this centrally to build out all the sub-projects. Use something like PM workspaces or Yarn workspaces to help manage that. And since you're using this, you can loop over all the project names basically and have exactly the same configuration or different depending on however you want to do it. Or you can implement each one individually, but it is a good opportunity, I think, to think about a monorepo because you can control it a lot better with this scripted sort of configuration.
Can it integrate with Docker for build and release instead of using other options out there for that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if by default it has anything related to Docker. However, the interfaces for GitHub Actions are completely available to you. So you can write your own components. That's the next thing I'm going to show is how to write your own component. But you can write your own component to say, I would like a workflow with GitHub that downloads, checks out the code, uses this version of Docker to do a build in a certain way, and then whatever the steps are that you want, you can configure that in a component, and it will write that YAML file out. And if you redistribute that component across all your projects, then you're going to have that identical kind of step, or you can reuse it in the same project. I mean, lots of it. Even if you never redistribute it, if you only use it in that one project, you're getting the consistency and type safety of using this engine basically to build it, and know that the YAML is going to be output correctly, and if there's something missing, you're going to get some kind of warning out of the system, because it understands what all the required fields are and what you're allowed to put there, numbers versus letters, whatever the problems are. Okay. Anything else? So the last thing that I'm going to show is, let's say that you want to build a VS Code configuration, settings.json inside the VS Code folder. So you want this common VS Code. There's nothing in this folder right now. The folder got created when I tested this out earlier. But there's no settings file in there. I've got a component that I already built inside of this Progen.rc. Progen.rc folder is sort of a special root level folder that says, I've got Progen.rc on the root, but if I have any custom components, I can put them inside of here. So it's not exactly the SRC directory, it's not source directory, it's like a special directory that's really just for the project configuration components. So in this case, I built a VS Code config component. I'm using this native VS Code. It already understands. See, this is coming from Progen. Progen already understands VS Code. It's just not written the file out exactly the way that I want it to be written out. So I'm saying, take the Progen VS Code config file, add some settings. These are some settings that I want. I want my rulers to be at these places, the tab size to be 2. These are probably familiar with anybody, for anybody that's used VS Code settings. Some other things about linting that I wanted to explicitly update things. And then I've also to have an extensions recommendation file for some extensions I want my team to also install in VS Code. That's the extensions.json file in the same location. So once I've written this component, this is pretty simple. It's really just taking existing pieces from Progen and saying configure them in exactly this way for my team. It extends this common component element, which also comes from Progen here. So you can see I'm not importing anything special. I'm not really writing a lot of fresh code. I'm really just taking pieces of Progen and configuring them. I'll show the spec, the test file real quick. It's kind of like the slide I just showed, except that I'm creating a TypeScript project, and I'm basically instantiating this component that I just wrote in order to test it. And then I'm saying synthesize the files, but don't write them to disk. Just make the string that will eventually be written to disk. And then expect that path, because that's where it's going to store it, .vscode/settings.json, to match the snapshot of whatever it was last time. So as I'm making changes to my Progen component, I can use this snapshot test as just a quick, easy way to say, did the output that's going to go to disk change because I broke something, or is it the same? So this is the dumbest, easiest test that you can do. You can also do very specific things to make sure a value is there that you expect, but I like starting here because it just covers the whole file in a kind of a shotgun approach. In order to use this, so let's see, we'll go back up here. VS Code folder has no files in it. I'm going to go in my Progen.rc file, which is where I've configured my whole project. I've got some commented out code here. Now I want to use this that I just created my shared config. It doesn't see it. Hold on. It's probably not in the path somewhere. It still doesn't see it. Just going to convince it that it knows about that provision. Uh-oh. There it is. All right, so because I didn't have an index like export or anything, it couldn't find it. But I'm basically just importing that up here. That's the statement that was missing. So now that I've said that, down here, I'm executing it. I saved the file. It's watching right now, so it should already exist, this file. There it is. So here's my settings file, and it got written just because I added that line to say, make me a settings config that matches whatever the template is for my organization. So that's how you can make a custom component that you can share across projects and choose which project get it and which projects don't, because there's opinions, and this allows you to still work with those opinions, work around them. And I think that's mostly everything that I had, unless people have additional questions. Yep.
Only this settings.json, the VS Code directory, read-only, or is it only for like?
Those files will be read-only, yeah. And there'll be a comment. There should be a comment somewhere at the top or bottom that says that. Yeah, there it is. Generated by project. So anything it creates, it wants to be read-only. There are escape hatches, so you can say, I don't want this to be read-only. Let's just let it be writable. But once you trigger that escape hatch, you got to stop using Progen because it's going to kablooey that file eventually. You know. So if you use Progen and you decide you don't want to use it anymore, you can do a one-time generation of everything, make them writable, and just like delete Progen and go on with your life. So, and that's a model you could use if you wanted to use this as a starting point and you really didn't want to use it on an ongoing basis, then you could do that. One of the other things that it does, it will create a GitHub action that will build the project according to what your configuration is, and it will, when it does the build, it also does linting. It does a linting step. So you may forget to lint locally, and you may upload your code to the repo. It's going to run this GitHub action that it creates optionally if you want it to, that will go ahead and lint. It will change whatever linting mistakes that it found. It will commit those back to the repository if you've configured it that way with permissions and everything. So it's kind of self-mutates in order to fix the problems for you. And all that it will write out pretty much automatically if you configure it with a couple very brief options, which is kind of nice. If you have team members that don't want to lint, they don't want to set up, you know, the pre-push, whatever the hooks are in order to make it happen when you do your git push. This is just a backup to do that. Cool.
Is it compatible with other monorepo managers like Turbo Repo or
Yes.
Sargon?
Yes, I have an example that is not on the screen right now. I use Turbo Repo, so I have had to write my own component. However, it's a very predictably shaped, configuration file. So I use Turbo Repo, and Turbo Repo, the second version, allows you to have per project configurations. So I have it spit out per project configurations, which lets you run through all the steps, in a unique order per sub-project, and then have your master kind of orchestrate what all those are and what order they run in as well, especially if one depends on another. So yes, I use it for that, and it works really well.
Is there a list of frameworks it's compatible with for monorepo?
Yeah, so I have a component that I wrote that builds the PNPM workspace file. It doesn't, I don't know why it doesn't do that, but again, that's pretty easy to do, pretty predictable. So really any sort of monorepo workspace sort of config you can do. It has here in the docs some quick starts for Node. That's where I thought you were going. I'm not sure this is really going to answer your question. For the monorepos, there's not really a list, but I mean, it has native file writers and formatters for object file types, which is YAML and JSON. So you can build your object basically and say, I want this to be a YAML file now or a JSON file, and just writes it out that way. TOML, you can write source code files with proper indenting if you want to write them programmatically. So if it doesn't do something that you want, you can pretty easily build it. And you can publish that out, and there are a lot of, I haven't looked lately, there might already be a turbo repo component out there that will just do what you want. People are releasing them all the time. All right, thanks for coming. Thanks for being here at the very last session.